Fire at Sea is a 2016 Italian documentary film that recently debuted on Netflix. The film is about the small Sicilian island of Lampedusa, a midpoint in the Mediterranean Sea between Sicily and Africa. Over the last 20 years, Lampedusa, with a population of only 6,000, has struggled to deal with the 400,000 African migrants that have sought to use the island as an entry point into Europe. It is also noted that 15,000 migrants have died during this time as a result of attempting the journey. Fire at Sea is a frustrating documentary in many ways. The politics of the European migrant crisis are not something I'm intimately familiar with, and the film does not go out of its way to explain the cause or causes of this mass exodus from Africa. The film is essentially two separate stories edited together in parallel. One story chronicles the day-to-day life of a young boy and his family living on Lampedusa. This boy and his family are not migrants, and their lives are not directly affected by the migrant issue. The second story documents the process of Lampedusan authorities rescuing distressed refugees from sinking or otherwise stranded vessels in the Mediterranean Sea. The only direct connection these two stories share is a doctor who treats both the young boy and the African refugees. Throughout the film, we get to know the young boy much more personally than any of the migrants, who are portrayed more as a collective than as individuals. I found this perspective somewhat dehumanizing, as it made it difficult for me to relate to the migrant situation. We see them in the worst of conditions, dehydrated and fighting for space in an impossibly cramped boat, surrounded by the bodies of other migrants who have succumbed to dehydration or other illness. Meanwhile, the authorities of Lampedusa are portrayed as going above and beyond for the migrants, using an enormous amount of resources and manpower to monitor the sea and respond to distress calls from migrant ships. Despite the fact that the migrants are treated somewhat dispassionately by the rescue workers, as they are herded like cattle, photographed and numbered, I still related more to the rescue workers than to the migrants. It is obvious that this cold and seemingly inhumane treatment is a necessary evil evolved to address the overwhelming numbers of migrants flooding the island. This often one-sided portrayal led me as a viewer to the conclusion that the migrants are incapable of helping themselves. Early in the film, we overhear a distress call from a sinking ship, where a rescue worker repeatedly asks the migrant caller for his location, while the caller is too panicked to stop crying for help. Ultimately, the caller fails to tell the rescue worker the location of the ship before the call is lost, and we later learn that every passenger of the vessel died on board. The dangers of sea travel are exemplified in the young boy's story. Even though the boy is from an island town and his father is a fisherman, the sea is still a challenge to him and something that requires acclimation. We see the boy struggling to row even a small boat and vomiting from seasickness after a short journey. This made me question the logic of the migrants, many of whom are from landlocked countries and have never seen the ocean prior to their journey, yet decided to take to the sea to flee their homeland. The only explanation we get for the migrants' mass exodus is told to us in a ritualistic prayer-like song sung by a group of migrants in a temporary refugee camp. The lead singer describes the hardship and violence his group has faced as they journeyed from one inhospitable land to another. He describes fleeing the violence of his home in Nigeria to travel across the Sahara Desert, where he encountered only more death and violence, before arriving in Libya, where he and his brethren were met with imprisonment. From this perspective, it becomes clear that the decision to take to the sea was made out of desperation and not logic. As the singer says, it is risky in life not to take a risk, because life itself is a risk. The events of the film are portrayed in the style of ultra-realism, as the filmmaker strictly adheres to the principle of show, don't tell. There is no score to direct the viewer's emotional response, only ambient sound, and there is no narrator to explain the meaning of the events you see on camera. Meanwhile, many scenes and shots are held for extended periods of time, almost refusing to look away from their subjects. These factors, I believe, are meant to provoke you as a viewer into drawing your own conclusions. That doesn't mean that the filmmaker's voice isn't present. Nowhere is the film's perspective clearer than in the metaphorical relationship between the story of the young boy and the migrant crisis. The young boy is diagnosed by the doctor with a lazy eye, the treatment for which is to cover his dominant eye with a patch in order to teach his brain to see from his lazy eye. I believe this is a metaphor for learning to see from a different perspective. This point is further emphasized by the young boy's relationship to the wildlife on Lampedusa. Early in the film, he is seen attempting to hunt a bird with a homemade slingshot, which he must use his dominant eye to aim. At the end of the film, with his dominant eye covered and his lazy eye growing stronger, the boy discovers a bird in a tree and attempts to communicate with it by imitating its song, rather than shoot it down. I believe the viewer is meant to take away from this allegory that changing your perspective and attempting to communicate with those who you could otherwise meet with violence or indifference will lead to greater understanding and compassion. Overall, Fire at Sea is effective in portraying the horror of the migrant crisis as it exists in Lampedusa. The film doesn't seek to provide a solution to this problem, but merely present the issue at face value. I can't say Fire at Sea was an enjoyable viewing experience, but it is thought-provoking and frustrating in a way I believe it was intended to be.